So Kaczynski, the Unabomber, homegrown terrorist because he targeted places in his own country rather than foreign terrorists. He, over the course of 17 years, he planted or mailed at least 16 bombs. He killed 3 people and wounded 24. He wasn't a religious fundamentalist, but he was a fundamentalist. His enemy was essentially modern society. He grew up in Chicago, attended Harvard, but he wound up living alone in a remote cabin in the Montana woods. And he was arrested in 1996 after one of the most notorious and longest manhunts in history. And he was sentenced to life in prison, so he'll never get out. And I think he's like 75 now. So still alive, still pumping out letters to people, propagandizing for the primitivist revolution.
Mm-hmm. Now, I think one thing that really jumped out, I was reading the manifesto that got published, and which we can talk about later, but there were some things that really stuck out to me, and I'm really excited to kind of get into a little bit of what was going on inside of his brain. I've kind of unceremoniously kind of titled this in my own head, like True Crime Meets Political Activism and How, Ted got it wrong. So, I mean, there are some really good bones in what he has to say. But overall, like I kind of, I dissected a few things and was like really curious to get your opinion. But how did his life start out?
Yeah, he was like good. Well, he was privileged in like a middle class family, suburbia. And he had a family who really valued academic achievement, and like gave him lots of love and affection, and put him on the path. He was very intelligent, scored really high in IQ tests, and did well at school. Struggled a bit socially.
Yeah, let's start there. Like him as a baby, because I didn't know that part of it. And I feel like I have some thoughts on that too, but I found that really fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the right at the start of the baby, this is a hard one because his mum tells this memory that's really important to her that the baby Ted had hives, and he was like very sick with it, and so he needed to be in the hospital to be looked after. But because what the nurses said was that they were short-staffed and they couldn't be like looking after visitors coming in and out and making sure that the visitors were going where they need to go and stuff. They literally just did not, at that period in time, did not let visitors into like the baby ward. And so he spent like at least a week in hospital where he was getting seen to sometimes by nurses, like changing and feeding him and stuff, but was not allowed to see his parents, wasn't allowed to hear their voices. She said that he came out of that very emotionally withdrawn and rejecting of them, like in terms of like emotional connection. And that's like, we have no way of knowing for sure if that had a lasting effect, and it might just be mother's way worried that they did something wrong when their son was a baby, when the baby was most vulnerable.
Well, I mean, I think she does kind of use this as a way to try and, in her brain, try and explain some of this. But I did read something where she had been talking about, she says she can still see, I found this on Washington Post. It was like from 96, where she just said that she could still see the photograph of Ted pinned down on the hospital bed. And she said it offered her what she now sees as a clue into how her oldest son grew into the troubled man he'd become. So she said that he looked terrified. He was spread-eagled. So the doctors were examining him. And, his eyes, which were usually normal, were crossed in fear. And so you think about that time period, which we won't spend a long time on. But, I've heard that I think someone in the documentary series was saying that essentially that if a baby is not able to bond with the mother, I mean, the kid's only 9 months old, I think, there's a chance of developing the psychopathy. So as a coping mechanism, I don't feel anything, I don't experience trauma. But of course, we know that's not true. Trauma is often the root of psychopathy forming in the first place. So that very well may have a small role to play here. And I mean, it seems legitimate.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, what's interesting to think about is like that must have been kind of traumatic for the parents as well, to have a baby rejecting you. And like, you would take like a skilled parent to not show that fear in their emotions with the baby, and not have it like a lasting effect. Like every time the kid rejects them as they grow older, like that they are like withdrawing from them and withdrawing this punishment. So there's like a shutting down there. And it might those that when you're very early, you're looking for it's really important to form like a secure connection. And if it's not formed, then it can be like an insecure connection in form of like avoidance, or it can be insecure in the form of like too clingy to the parents and rejecting the world. So there's always all kinds of ways that it could have manifested. But yeah, there's a really interesting experiment that psychology. There was a study in the 70s where they looked at the facial expressions of parents, and it was called the still face experiment, or stone face experiment, where it's really heart-wrenching to watch, but the parents and babies, to see what degree the baby can form this emotional obscure attachment. And it's that parents will pull a completely blank, straight face, show no emotion, and the baby will usually do everything it can to get the parents' attention again, until it starts to look away because it can't bear seeing the blank face anymore. So then trying to comfort themselves by sucking their thumb, and then finally, when the parent re-engages emotionally, the baby usually cries out of stress relief at being reminded of the secure attachment that's available again. So it's like, it's really, really, really important. And that would have been stressful for the baby for sure.
Yeah. I mean, I can see that there's a whole host of things that go through my mind, but I do think that kind of him growing up, and kind of what I was learning about him, just in primary school, is that, super smart kid. And, you've already got a kid who feels like there's an abandonment possibility, there's abandonment issues, and a lack of trust. So I feel like what you're going to walk us through next is kind of Ted's feeling of not belonging, not being like everyone else. It seems to be something that it can be traced back to that time in the hospital, the feeling of abandonment, not trusting. He kind of already feels like an outsider. And that's also another kind of textbook description of how psychopathy forms. So
yeah, or even just that the parent, like, it was like a strained relationship with the parent, that like the parent really wanted to be attached, so like to never, in their mind, to never betray the baby again, and like to have this really secure attachment. So be clingy, and then the if they ever saw any signs of Ted being kind of problematic to people, that they would like kind of like play it down, because they just really wanted like to make sure that he was like safe and like developing okay, but that they, in their mind, they would justify some of the things they saw as just like, he needs protection, he needs like care and stuff. So
I do think that was a form of her making excuses for, I think there was clear anger. There are certain stories that the son tells. I forgot the brother's name already.
Yeah.
But stories David. He tells, David, tells about, some really jarring incidents that happen. And I think there is that denial by at least the mother that it doesn't have a deeper meaning, and that she somehow is responsible for making him feel safe, or I don't know, that could just be my opinion.
Yeah, for sure. And it's just about teaching parents to know how to be open with it. Like it's problematic that she felt like she wasn't a good parent, and it's problematic that the kid was experiencing that in a way, and so it wasn't developing a secure attachment. So I don't know, it's complicated.
Mm-hmm.
But his dad taught him, was teaching him a lot at home, making sure that he was like really doing well at school, and this was like a source of pride for him to just focus all his mind on studying. And at some point the school just said, we should put him forward a year because he's obviously a lot smarter than, a lot further ahead than the kids in his year. And so we skipped 1 year and just went straight into another year above. And he in his diaries or in his like any like interviews or anything, he always says that was really difficult for him, like an already socially awkward kid, just not fitting into a year above him. So some alienation from society and the institutions that he was part of as a kid at that point. Do you want to go to psych experiments to CIA? Or
yes, I would like to hear more about that. Yes.
Yeah. After moved forward a year in school, secondary school, and then before he'd even finished school, like 1 year before he finished high school, after being already a year ahead, he got accepted a year early into Harvard, like the most prestigious school. And he went to that like 2 years younger than most students in Harvard. So he was like having picnics on the grass on his own, and like just not knowing how to connect with people. And he entered this social psychological experiment with like the most like impressive psychology professor there, about which was advertised as him as a place it wasn't advertised as a psychology experiment. It was advertised as a place where you could debate professors and have your ideas tested, have your ideas like received and judged and like reviewed. And like he thought that he was going to get a chance to like be like genuinely evaluated. Mm-hmm. And so we didn't have many friends or any really strong friends at all at Harvard, but he had these like sessions from the whole 3 years that he was at Harvard. He had these really intense sessions with professors, which he through his like study and through wanting to be like them, he really admired and valued. And they were testing, to see how to play mind games with people in order to do advanced interrogations. It would later get used in like Guantanamo Bay and stuff like how to break someone down and make them say what you want to say, or make them say things that you think they want to say deep down, but just like madness.
So basically the intent is to make them question themselves on things that they feel they believe strongly. And I mean, part of me wants to know if like his intention for, being involved in the experiment in the first place was to maybe learn a little bit more about himself and his own social issues.
Absolutely.
And this ended up just compounding that and making it worse and adding to his feelings of humiliation or ineptitude. Which also then, to me, I kind of found like a pattern that through his writing too that made me think of that. But do you think that this? Well, I mean, I don't see how this could make a positive impact on a person. But I mean, we have to study these things somehow. But he already seemed super. He wrote a lot. He was super smart. He was, so mathematically intelligent that it kind of makes me feel a little nervous because I have a bad relationship with mathematics. So
he was excelling at maths and sciences because it was something you could do on your own and just like really dedicate all your mind to. and he probably wasn't like thinking. He probably wasn't like reading like political theory books or anything like that. So he had some funny beliefs about, well, to me, funny beliefs about primitivism and about how less technology is good. And he hadn't yet decided that like we needed an anti-tech revolution or anything. He just thought that like, I guess he wanted maybe at this point, like he wanted more like he was against like big cities and very systematized, atomized society. He liked the suburbia life that he came from, and he didn't like metropolises. But and sorry, go on.
Something just sprung into my head, and this is extremely like personal, but I came from a homeschooling background, and it was extremely oppressive. And then I got to college. I somehow was able to make the right score to get into college, and that's totally due to my older sister. But once I was there, I cannot tell you. So I feel like I'm not going to draw a parallel between myself and Ted, but coming from somewhere where I had so much isolation, once I got to college, it was the most traumatic experience, I think, of my adult life, because I had to suddenly have a roommate that I didn't know who this person was. I didn't know how to study for tests. I had only taken one test in my whole life. All of these things compounded around entering university for the first time that just, I think, has exacerbated all of my personal anxieties. And I feel like that is possibly a huge catalyst for, you're told that everybody's social, you need to go out, you need to put yourself out there. And let me tell you, that's one of the worst things I ever did for myself, because I was like, maybe you just don't know what fun is. Maybe you just need to put yourself in these uncomfortable situations because that's what everybody else is doing. And as somebody who's an introvert, it was not a fun period of life, and it was constantly feeling inadequate in social situations. So I can sort of see a glimpse into the mind of someone who kind of wanted some normalcy, but just couldn't quite get there. I don't know. That just jumped in my head.
No, for sure. Like definitely, like wearing, like he didn't know whether he fitted in, and like he probably felt like he was like wearing different people's clothing, like trying out different identities. And so with the professors, he would have been just like asking like questions that like can come from a naive place, like we had like the President Trump like talking about like injecting chemicals into bleach into your body and stuff. Like people have like weird things where they haven't like fully thought through. And so he had some primitive beliefs, and he was like connecting that to like psychology and like why he didn't fit in and why he felt alienated. And he was trying to use these arguments and test them with the professors and see what they thought. And all the time they were like they were just like, it was highly regimented, like we're gonna pretend we agree with you for a bit, and then we're gonna like tear you down, and just not nice.
Yeah. And I mean, the whole idea of a university setting, it is also jarring when, I think a lot of his early ideas could have been formed in that moment, probably more strongly than others, as far as everybody kind of looking like sheep. Everybody does the same things. Everybody's a part of this system. And one that he didn't feel a part of, and one that he maybe felt alienated from and started to resent. I think those started to probably really solidify during this period.
Yeah. And what friends he did have in university would say that like different periods of the psych experiment, he would just never like eat dinner with them, or like he would take if they tried to sit down with him, like he would just be so like angry with himself and people around him that he just take himself off back to his room and spend as little time around people as possible.
Wow.
So, should we talk about dates and romance and like how that affected his trying to inspect sexual development? So he there's one example with him chatting to a woman in the university library and her giving him her number, phone number, and but then him writing in his diary that he couldn't get up the nerve to call. So his defense mechanism for this, like feeling so anxious and nervous about being able to trying to call and then not feeling like he was able to. His defense mechanism was to chastise himself for spending so much time worrying about connecting with some dumb woman. So his feelings of inadequacy projected onto like a lower class, other identities, lower class, like women and gay people and all sorts. But so that was interesting. And then he started to have sexual fantasies of becoming a woman. I think because he didn't know how to have a relationship with women, so he wanted to explore desires for women, which he hadn't had the space to learn to understand. I definitely don't think it was out of any felt emergence of gender identity as a woman or anything, because they're called autoerotic fantasies. So he made an appointment to go see the university psychologist, and at the last minute decided he didn't want to talk about having sex change, didn't want to talk about his sexual fantasies. And he writes in his diary that this is when the first desire to kill happened. He says, I felt disgusted about what my uncontrolled sexual cravings had almost led me to do, and I felt humiliated, and I violently hated the psychiatrist. Just then there came a major turning point in my life. Like a phoenix, I burst from the ashes of my despair to a glorious new hope. So I said to myself, why not really kill that psychiatrist and anyone else whom I hate? I will kill, but I will make at least some effort to avoid detection so that I can kill again. So some very dark thoughts there.
Well,
that's what happened.
And I think it's interesting that he did write so much, because I think there'd be a lot of unanswered questions if we didn't have a lot of his writing. And I think his confusion, part of that confusion is, I think one of his neighbors or somebody in the documentary had talked about how he just clearly just hated women. And I think we're coming back to that theme of inadequacy and self-loathing and those patterns that he likes to, seems like he's turned that on everybody else at this point in his writings later on, that I find very interesting.
Yeah, and we see that today with incel people, bombers, driving their van into people and having this whole they gather on Reddit and they have this whole worldview of Chads and Stacys and how they're oppressed because women aren't traditional enough anymore, and so it's a weird phenomenon
and a way of deflection as well.
Yeah, definitely.
So clearly, I'm always talking about mental health anytime that I can, and growing up with someone who's schizophrenic and extremely abusive, it's one of those things where you can see the pattern and you can see it worsening at a certain period of time in life where there's some traumatic event. And just thinking about the person that I knew before and during and after, it's if only that person had gotten the help that they needed. He seems to be such an intelligent guy with deep feeling, but extremely damaged. But, I think we as a society are getting a little bit smarter about catching these things and being a little bit more open and embracing of handling our issues with mental health and therapy and things of that nature.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, people being open about their mental health problems this would have been a time when it would have been it would have been the worst thing in the world to come out as having depression even or anything. Social standing and your neighbours and stuff, you wouldn't be invited around to dinner or anything. And yeah, I don't know, like as well, like when we're jumping forwards a bit here, but after he after he sent like he gave a letter to his brother that explained his feelings to about another woman, and or that he thought about killing this other woman, and his brother just thought it was like a psychological break. He thought that it wasn't serious, and so there's not understanding about mental health, and then there's also if he loyalty to his brother, not wanting to turn him in because of our prison system and police system, that that prison life is so horrible that you never want to do that to your brother, make the police aware that and then put him through that system if you don't think he's going to be violent for in the future. If you make that judgment, then it's a scary thing to think with our current system that you'd have to turn someone over to exist in this horrible prison system.
Well, and not just that, but I do remember, and you said his name was David.
Yeah.
That he had mentioned how, his mother had told him the story of Ted as a baby, and how she had kind of put responsibility on his shoulders as well to always look out for and take care of and protect his brother. And he was always just like, well, why? Yeah, I love him. Why would I not? So there is all of this enabling being done by his family. And of course, that is a time both of my parents grew up in, where mental health was, and that's why my mom has still been completely adamant about not admitting to anything and not seeing someone for help. It's that it's like this ultimate shame to have to admit that there's an issue there. Yeah. So, I mean, then you have all these people around you enabling you, it's kind of giving you free rein to keep going.
Yeah, it's really sad. And there'll be denial as well. The brothers had an interesting relationship. You have examples of, the connection between siblings is really, really strange. People, two things that come into mind. It's just there was a weird case of sisters running in front of traffic that went viral, and it was because they had kind of they maybe had some schizophrenia, but then because they were always around each other, they confirmed each other's psychosis beliefs, and then got further down that track, and so those that connection between siblings is really, can be really strong and really hard to work through. There was the marathon bombers. They both committed murders together. The older brother leading the other young brother into that life. And yeah, David. David and Ted would spend a lot of time with their dad out on camping holidays to the wilderness and stuff. And then from 16, they'd been taught in bushcraft and stuff, and so then they saw it as a really special thing to survive by their own wits, and they would go off on their own to build encampments and then cabins, and then but at some point David started settling down and started leading more normal life, but would still and then Ted's idea was always to move permanently, very off grid, and he hoped that David would be like that as well, and would justify it for the same reasons of being anti-tech. But at some point their ideas split, and one interesting memory was after he came back from Harvard, David noticed the difference where before they were like bouncing ideas off each other and being very like interested in what each other had to say. And after the psych experiments, maybe he was just very dismissive and very ruthless towards his ideas and like putting them down.
Yeah.
So and then I mean, it's a good thing there was a split in terms of David not following his path, but it would have been more ideal if Ted had followed David, I don't know.
Well, tell me a little bit about more about his early ideologies, and because that leads into a thought that I had when reading, and kind of let us know how this whole manifesto ended up being kind of published, and then we can kind of go into more of our own personal thoughts about his ideology.
Sure. So Plant's first desires to kill after seeing the university psychiatrists about sexual fantasies, feeling humiliated in that place, connecting like psychiatrists to the psychology experiments, maybe. And anyone else he hated, so like institutions, the university that kind of he felt had betrayed him. He went to live. He took on a professorship in order to earn enough money to then go and build a cabin in Montana. And he was living out there for a bit, and the first actual like him going through the plans to kill was building a parcel bomb. And he said his reasons. He's given his diary entry on the day that he did it. Let me just find it. Oh yeah, so he just talks about like wanting to try and get away from it all, trying to be at peace in the wilderness, in wildlife habitat, and then going like hunting, walking around, and then seeing some destruction, seeing some. He saw like a new road being built very close to his cabin, and that enraged him. And because these like anti-tech ideas that had cemented, and he just says, and then I returned home as quickly as I could because I have something to do. And then he said, you can in a letter to someone, he said, you can guess what it was that I had to do. So it came like he was getting scrap from like neighbors and garages and building these pipe bombs in his cabin, and it was probably like, like the sexual fantasies about becoming a woman, and then the sexual fantasies probably morphed into killing the psychiatrist, because that whole meeting, and so these kind of like building these bombs was probably like writing about in his diary was probably a relief. Like he felt like a phoenix coming out of the ashes. Like, but then actually building these bombs was probably a way of his like getting these frustrations of like the traumas maybe, but also just his anger at the world that he'd like projected his own insecurities onto the world. So that was the first bomb, and it was sent to a university, sent to like an engineering department, because he saw like advanced he saw like scientists like progressing this like the situation that he was like brought into in university, and he returned fairly soon after that. I think he spent a bit of time in the cabin. Then he would travel by coach out of the cabin in order to place these parcel bombs in places, because I think he knew that the postal system could be tracked. So he was like posting in like random places around America that they wouldn't be able to connect back to the cabin or him. And so when he was in that trip back to place the parcel bomb, the visited his family home, and he went to work at this family factory that to earn some money to earn enough food to stay to go back to the cabin again. And that was, and then there's a whole story about him trying to date the girl and that going wrong. Should you want to talk about that? Anything? Or do you?
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, to earn some money, Ted had moved back from his cabin to the family home to work at the foam cutting factory where his father and brother worked. He briefly dated a female supervisor at the factory, but the woman cut off the relationship after a few dates. Ted responded by posting crude limericks around the factory, like sticky notes all over the walls. And Dave, his brother Dave, who worked part-time at night as a night supervisor, confronted Ted in the storage room as he was putting up one of these notes. And it was a turning point in their relationship. Dave is like remembering this as like a really tragic event where he said he remembered Ted looking at him like a friend, and then by the time he got done speaking to him, he was all like emotionally shut down, and like you betrayed me. You're not in an affinity with me anymore. Mm-hmm. The next day, Ted walked up to. So David was saying to him, "You can't, if you put any more of these notes up, you're going to get fired." And the next day, Ted walked up to the machine where Dave was working and posted a note right in front of him and said, "Are you going to fire me now, Ted?" Ted asked, and heartbroken Dave replied, "Yeah, Ted, go home." And Ted did, shutting himself in his room for days. And Dave worried he'd forced some sort of psychological break. Ted eventually knocked on Dave's bedroom door and handed him a letter. "I'll show this to you only on the condition that you don't discuss this with me," Ted said. And it was a note Ted intended to send to the woman explaining himself. It was an apology of sorts, but it also contained the disturbing claim that Ted was so enraged that he had waited in the woman's car with a knife, planning to mutilate her. In the end, Ted wrote he couldn't do it. Attacking someone face to face proved too much for him. So yeah.
And once again, I think that probably made him extremely angry that if that is true, and if indeed he did sit in the back of her car and wait for her and then sort of chicken out, that would add more to the fuel to his fire of feeling inadequate and like he just couldn't do anything. So I think that if that is indeed the case, could also play a part there. But I was going to ask you, so going forward from that point, when do you think, or what is the basis for the targets that he chose? Because of course we know about his just overall arching mistrust of technology and the Industrial Revolution. So how did that play a role in who he chose to send bombs to?
Yeah, it's weird. So the first one, we can say that we can guess confidently that it was like he was picking. First speaking, I can tell you about what he talked about afterwards in prison, about kind of what he's like propagandizing now in terms of like, and then I can backtrack to like what he was thinking then. Now he's arguing that people should take down electricity grids and target like the leaders of like the cutting edge of like biotech, nanotech scientists and engineers because they're like leading progress in technology, and they're like symbols of but he actually like he writes, or he talks about that in an interview, that he didn't even know about like other environmentalists taking direct action until after like a few years into his life in the cabin, and like after he'd sent a few bombs. So I think he was thinking that he was like picking really good targets that were like that some people would intellectually admire him for, or at least he admired himself for picking. And yeah, it was about it wasn't necessarily political. It was like an anti-tech revolution. It was about like just like destroying the technological system that's to an extent, like to get. He might have desired to be a hermit in the forest, but he knew that as far back as we can get, we could go is to a situation of like the Middle Ages, of like people with like swords and bow and arrows and stuff, of like destroying assembly lines, destroying electricity grids to make people in a situation of survival where it's not reasonable to try and rebuild electricity grids and factories and stuff. So yeah, it's a weird one. Like he talks about finding like Earth First monkey wrenching manuals and stuff, and newsletters like on his travels, like a few years into his life in the government. But so he kind of like post hoc tied it to that of like pretending. I mean, he wants to. He like from prison. He's writing lots of letters. He's wanting to be a symbol for this like anti-tech revolution. He's tying to lots of things. Like he's saying like primitivists should ally with Al Qaeda and try and find solidarity there and stuff. So I think he's like eco-fascist. He's or neo-Luddite. It's complicated. He inspired groups that he inspired groups that were on the left wing, and then to come over to the right wing to. So I mean, we can go into that later, but it's interesting.
Yeah, well, lead us up to, because I have some choice things to say about just like what I read of his writing that really struck a chord with me. But I was curious to see, okay, the timeline from there until he got caught, and then what his demands were. Yeah. I don't want to jump the gun or anything, but over how many years did his pipe bombs, how long did that span? That was
17 years, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because he had a break for a long time, but yeah, 17 years.
So he did a relatively decent job at covering his tracks.
Yeah.
For a while. So what ended up being kind of the downfall of that?
Yeah, right. So for anyone who didn't know, he offered to stop bombing for newspapers publishing his manifesto. He'd already written papers to universities advocating his like anti-tech philosophy under his real name. But he wanted like a wider readership. He wanted like he just made this offer. I don't think it was genuine. He had made a bomb like after they'd already published it, and like I think the bomb making was like his like anger and frustration, and that was always going to carry on. He wasn't going to be able to keep his word, but so I don't know whether he even offered it in genuine as a genuine offer. But he said he wrote a letter to the New York Times saying, "We this is his propagandizing, like he's putting on like a voice of a revolutionary." But he says, "We are getting tired of making bombs. It's no fun having to spend all your evenings and weekends preparing dangerous mixtures, filling trigger mechanisms out of scraps of metal, or searching the Sierras for a place isolated enough to test the bomb." That was like he wrote. I'll just like that's him like trying to mislead the investigation as well. Like he would write letters pretending to be like an
actual movement, like a group of people.
Exactly.
And also
like okay, so he says, so we offer a bargain. We have a long article between 29,000 and 30,000 words that we want to have published. If you can get it published according to our requirements, we will permanently desist from terrorist activities. And then so we could talk about contents of the manifesto, like all the arrests. That led to his arrest because, as a result of his brother recognizing his writing in his manifesto, his brother helped build his cabin and enjoyed a life close to the wilds, but wasn't fundamentalist about it in the way Ted was. And yeah, like he'd sent lots of like ranting letters to Ted about his wife and his living a normal life and how he betrayed him. And he had like lots of diaries at his home, and I think he'd written like a what's it called, like a proto version of the manifesto in an earlier draft. Mm-hmm. And so yeah, as soon as the FBI got that, they knew they had the right person, basically, through a new science of linguistic comparison or something. They were like finding that they were profiling who this person might be, and it fit all the dots from his communiques and then the similarities and everything. So, should you want me to tell a bit about what the manifesto contained?
Yeah, that would be great.
So very detailed. It starts with the industrial society has been a disaster for the human race. Industrial society and its consequences have been a disaster for the human race, and then that pretty much is like the motto of the whole thing. Lays very detailed blame on technology for destroying human scale communities. So like our psychology maybe in hunter-gatherer times we can only remember like 100 faces. So he contends that the Industrial Revolution harmed the human race by developing into a socio-political order that subjugates human needs beneath its own. The system, he wrote, destroys nature and suppresses individual freedom. In short, humans adapt to machines rather than vice versa, resulting in a society hostile to human potential. He indicts technological progress with the destruction of small human communities and rise of uninhabitable cities controlled by an unaccountable state. He contends that the relentless technological progress will not dissipate on its own because individual technological advancements are seen as good despite the sum effects of this progress. And he describes modern society as defending this order against dissent, in which individuals are adjusted to fit the system and those outside it are seen as bad.
I find it's super interesting because like in the documentary series, there's a gentleman, I think he was some kind of scholar or professor as well, was talking about how as you read it, it doesn't necessarily, if you were reading it on its own, it's not necessarily going to be something that's going to start shocking you immediately. There's some really good points being made, but I got through the first 3 pages and had so many notes. I was like, well, I can't just dissect this whole thing because there's just not enough time. Yeah. But I agree with the gentleman that there are some really good points that are made and valid points that any other individual making them wouldn't seem like shocking. But so in a sense, like I agree with his sense of urgency to act when he's talking about how technology is speeding up the process of like the destruction of the natural world around us. So like in his introduction, he articulated pretty intelligently, I think, just saying the Industrial Revolution and its consequences have been a disaster for the human race. They've greatly increased the life expectancy of those of us who live in advanced countries, but they have destabilized society, have made life unfulfilling, have subjected human beings to indignities, have led to widespread psychological suffering. And then he also said it will certainly subject human beings to greater indignities and inflict greater damage on the natural world. All true, all very true, okay? Mm-hmm. Yeah. But what I start to have problems with is my opposition to that would be that, technology is going to continue to progress. It's progressing extremely quickly. I think that we have to turn our attention to utilizing technology to turn some of these things around and to help salvage our planet. Because, we've come this far. No one is just going to go to that monastic lifestyle and drop all of technology and just live off the grid. We already know that there's just no way that that's going to really happen. So I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, well, the world can only could only possibly sustain like 100 million people as like living hunter gatherer alive, and we're at like 7-8 billion now. So it's an argument for like genocide basically. Yeah, I don't know. It's like technology is the Pandora's box. It's like you can try to get one country to go back to the Middle Ages, but other countries are just going to outcompete and be more like more strong in their security measures to stop that from happening again, and just build up and build up. So yeah, I mean, primitivists, they have lots of good critiques about psychology and like social alienation. It's just that it's very tantalizing because it's like a simple principle that just like can apply to all things that you think is like universal. But then they apply it to every single critique. They apply it to every single like strategy of moving away from this kind of status quo. So the primitivist critiques like even like the most like far left like anarcho-communism of all like living in harmony. Like they critique the strategy towards that as like still oppressive towards like your individual freedom. And it's tempting because it's so simple, but like it's like there's lots of like little plot holes in his argument where like he's saying like the primitive man will be able to deal with like the harsh realities of primitive life like stoically, but like there's no reason why we can't just deal with like technology stoically and like find ways of finding a balance between living like a low impact lifestyle, but also like being able to pour our passions into like a technical job if we desire to do it, and if it's like work around co-ops and stuff. Like I don't see anything wrong with that.
Well, I think one thing that really strikes me is, I mean, I try my best to stay away from politics because most people don't love my politics. But when he says that this is not to be a political revolution, its object will be to overthrow not governments, but the economic and technological basis of the present society. Mm-hmm. To me, unfortunately, I think he's viewing this from a perspective that's purely like from the 90s and before, because if you look at today's climate and everything, in this current stage of history, we find ourselves kind of enmeshed in both a political and economic related revolution, just because at least here in the States, and I'm sure everywhere, big business interests invest so much money in buying our politicians. Just look at the whole Joe Manchin and the oil industry recently, all that news that's coming out. But just knowing that it's so enmeshed that you really can't separate the two. So like revolution in my head looks like a complete dismantling of the way money is allowed to be used in government decision making. And, you know, there's too much corruption that even if we all as citizens decided to go live lifestyles like he was living, it's still not going to stop corporations. You know, it's not going to stop people from, you know, working for these corporations. And, you know, it's indicative of just this cycle, you know, like where Kaczynski believes that a violent war should be waged against, you know, big industry and technology. Like I see the root of much needed change needing to be made in our political system first, taking the big money out of politics, the bribery, lobbying, and corporate donations, et cetera, blah, blah, blah. That's where we should be focusing our energies and motivations to change it. And instead of becoming angry, withdrawn, and, you know, antisocial, there's a way to get our voices out there to make change happen. But the system that we're in right now, it's making too many people comfortable, you know, at the top. That it's not going to change if you send bombs to people. I mean, it's just going to solidify that stronger for them.
Yeah,
as being the victims.
Yeah, it's provoked fear, and fear is like leads people to like want protection and will like even desire police more, and they're like stronger policing and more punitive policing. So I mean, there's all kinds of like philosophical justifications that people will like fall into to think this way. Like for Ted, it was that the longer you leave it, like the worse the collapse will be. Like he thinks that the collapse is inevitable. So to provoke it to happen sooner is like a altruistic act. So like to the end justifies the means of like bring the system down now, and then like the destruction of the environment will be less. But I just see like another like it just like holding back, like causing more chaos, so like more like environmental inefficiency, and then like industrial revolutions happening again and causing even worse environmental problems. So I don't know, like there's a whole spectrum of justifications for like civil disobedience up to like revolutionary direct action, and I guess there's maybe people, there are groups that there is like a slippery slope where there's like groups have bought into like some direct action tactics here, and then because of his writing have felt like fine being like a terroristic force if they think like the state is terrorizing people, like Guantanamo Bay, like or even far back as like Vietnam, like white phosphorus. Like if the state is going to act as this terrorizing force on people, then people are allowed to act as like a terrorizing force back against the state or something, or against technology. So it's a weird one. But then I think that is a fundamental, like it's the nurture nature debate. I think as soon as you make that, as soon as you see people as the problems and not like the systems that create people, then you're wanting to hurt like a populace of people, and in order to save one populace of people, and I don't know, it's a dark world that isn't rationally justified for me.
Well, I think one last thing that just stuck out to me, like as an overall theme, is like we talked about earlier, it's kind of cropped up a bit, is clearly him viewing leftists as emasculated, self-loathing pansies. And to me, that therein lies like the danger of lumping all of the radical left into the same category, because there's so many different, it's like a web. It's something that we as a society do very well. We like to put people in boxes and groups and categorize them all as the same thing. And I think he hits at an important indicator that the overall makeup of the leftists, kind of to me, is a reflection of his feelings of inferiority towards himself. I think by feeling of inferiority, he says we mean not only inferiority, feelings in the strict sense, but a whole spectrum of related traits: low self-esteem, feelings of powerlessness, depressive tendencies, defeatism, guilt, self-hatred. All of that just seems like you're just taking a quick look at yourself and writing it down, because but he's pinning that. And I think people who tend to be damaged in this way have a difficult time of seeing that within themselves, but everybody else has that problem. I think, though, that some of it does ring true overall, and that's the last thing I'll say about the manifesto, is that I see kind of the opposite coming out, and it's giving me a lot of hope for the future. But you see the opposite of that in people like Bernie Sanders or AOC or Rashida Tlaib, or, among many, many others I see recently, who have a strong and passionate voice and an unyielding like pushback to corporate greed and these powers that be that, they're finally putting their money where their mouth is. And that's important. We need more people like that to be filling up our government spaces. But, that doesn't seem to be just a self-loathing pansy, like have to be politically correct. I think you have on both sides irritating things that people tend to fall back on, and that political correctness on the left. Everybody has to be validated. But I do think it's one of those things where, he may have a slight point there, but I'm a little curious about where he would come down currently about what's happening in the world, or at least the United States in the past year to 4 years. Like, where would he be in all of this? I have a few thoughts, but what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I just think populist right. Like, I mean, it's weird on like there's fascism is just this like psychology of hate, and it's not like theory based. It's not like we're gonna like bring people onto our side by advocating this attitude to like the masses, the majority of people. Like, we're going to create this like elite underclass, and that's like this. So I put him like very, very far right of these like this. Have you heard of Atomwaffen division, of like this weird neo-Nazi terror group? They want to. Their ideal is to attack nuclear power stations in order to create enough chaos in the world to like have everything go to shit, and then so that they can build up like their new 1,000-year Reich from the ground up. And they're kind of like imagining this like primitive life that they'll have to lead to, that will refine them in some way. Like they'll have to they'll be like the best ones to deal with this. And yeah, that's very similar to Ted, I think, in that like it's a contempt for the disabled and the people that will die in a primitivist world. And it's about like this elite underclass that will show the way to the new world. And there's a thing called national anarchism, which is about like racial separatism, but like kind of decentralized fascist microstates. And I think that's what he's thinking in terms of like allying with Al Qaeda and stuff, and like they'll cause enough chaos over there in order to create their mini states, fascist states, and we'll create enough chaos over here, and we'll live like racially separated worlds. And yeah, it's weird. It's eco-fascist, I would say.
I can't help but think about. There's something that I saw that you had written too that kind of made me think in this direction. You talking about, if there had been someone who would have, been able to assassinate Hitler, early on. It goes into that vein. Do you want to explain that thought that you had?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, so yeah, depending on different time periods you live in, like people can be more or less sympathetic to the spectrum of direct actions. So yeah, like a way of like slipping into this mentality is that most people agree anyone who took it upon themselves to assassinate Hitler a day before the breakout of World War II would be seen as committing an ethical act, no matter who follows, because throwing a wrench into the cult of personality spell built around Hitler would be a significant setback for the fascist state's grip over the people. And given all the evidence pointing to the inevitability of war, such an act could easily be seen as a necessary preemptive act. So, do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, I thought also it made me think of North Korea. I also think about what is in Ted's head and what that would look like if it existed. And the closest thing that my mind can think of is a dictatorship, much like North Korea, where everything is shut down. We don't know what's going on. There's a certain stringent story that everybody is being told, and everything is highly, highly regulated. But to me, I think it correlates a little bit with North Korea's, and it's like I've I've read that we have people or like spies or military in place there, that if we so desired, we could take out Kim Jong-un. Okay. So with that in mind, it's like, well, everybody wants to ask, why don't you do it? Why don't you do it right now? But, in addition to like all of the complexities that would kind of kick off, even if that is like the right thing to do. I mean, you've got people starving, you have people, being mass murdered. It's almost like another Holocaust happening, but it's just less, we just don't know. We don't know the extent of it. I'm sure our government does know, but it's just so locked down. But I think one thing that we can't disregard is the fact that the U.S. specifically, or us here, we're not going to act upon a moral imperative. And I'm not trying to sound like super depressing here, but we're not going to act on a moral imperative of bringing down oppressive dictatorships due to the fact that like taking action would, save lives or,
For sure.
It's going to be more of an economic thing. It's like, how does that, they don't have oil. It's not something we care about. So we like to use this moral imperative as like, well, we had to invade Iraq because of blank, blank, blank. No, it comes down to Middle East equals oil, and we want that oil. So I think what does he have to say that's going to explain all of that? That I think our society is forever driven by not just technology, but by money and what we can get out of it.
Yeah. Yeah. The US CIA said they had like a report where they advocated that we put the Ba'athist party back in power after we'd taken over. The thing with Saddam Hussein wasn't what was the thing with the Ba'ath Party wasn't that it was like a secret, horrible authoritarian regime. It was that like Saddam wasn't doing what America wanted them to do. So remove Saddam, but keep all the party horribleness in power. And yeah, so Ted is cheerleading kind of ISIS and the kind of reaction that comes as a result of those imperial blunders and stuff. But it's all to create this. It's not cheer on useful opposition for creating a new society. It's cheer on just chaos and hope that we can get back to primitive hunter gatherer life.
That's what it seems like to me, and that's where my confusion lies. Because when we talk about those things, it's hard to imagine that, if chaos were allowed to just tear everything down, that somehow we'd get back to a better way of living. It's like once you have this, it sounds like just it's dystopian nightmare of, how on earth would that be? It would just, I'd rather live in The Walking Dead than that. Yeah.
And people, so it's weird. People will get bought into this ideology by believing, getting scared of the news and getting sure that a collapse will come and it'll just be inevitable anyway. And so they need to prepare and they need to encourage other people to hold this philosophy and hold this idea of needing to get ready for the defending your areas from starving masses and stuff. Yeah, it's a very weird one. Let's see. Sorry. He definitely didn't like mass movements. He didn't have the confidence in them, in people working together. But I think he had an idea. I don't know. I think that's a bit naive. I think that's not just lack of confidence in people. That's an overconfidence in the lack of. Do you know what I mean? I think it's a confidence that's worth critiquing about. Sorry, I'm not explaining it very well. He had a naivety about human potential, but a naive optimism about an elite underclass who will always be willing enough to risk their lives to tear down industrial society. So even stop it re-emerging if it ever could be destroyed. And to an extent, social movement membership is tied to events which are hard to predict, like the children who grew up in the formerly fascist countries after World War II formed. They form the most active left-wing militant movements, which can be understood to be in part an anger at their parents' generation for buying into fascism. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just about learning those lessons to counsel people to take only the actions which are ethical and the consequences they are comfortable living with to make the movement as sustainable as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, like with good direct action, sometimes people will get caught, and it doesn't have to be a total loss to the movement. The publicity received for a worthwhile act of civil disobedience, like for a Nelson Mandela, can be a net gain, but it does have to be a struggle people can sympathise with. So I don't see people being inspired by primitivist terror attacks ever catching on as a mass movement.
And I've forgotten the primitivist ideology. Words are difficult. Ideology. As far as that goes with him, what do you think is the most important thing for people to know about his beliefs in that department?
Well, just that it's a really like bad rabbit hole to get down. Like there's you get primitivist conspiracists on all sides of the political spectrum. You can even get centrist conspiracy theorists who just think everything would be fine. We could go back to the normal centrist status quo if it wasn't for this big tech shadow government. But to the extent there are these irrational rabbit holes people can fall down anywhere on the political spectrum, they can act as a kind of wormhole which fast tracks people to diametrically opposite political positions. So as an example, how this can happen on the far left is if you're struggling with the contradictions of having, say, a personal trauma which leads you to primitivism, and a kind of far leftism which isn't inherently against people finding value in highly technical work. You might be worried that you could be overthrowing the current government, but will still be socially alienated from a demeaning factory work job that is just slightly more democratic. And then from that point, find more common cause with anarcho-capitalists for just desiring to hoard what they can and kill anyone who comes onto their property, or fascists who want to hoard all the wealth for white people's sake. So yeah, and that's definitely happened with the Unabomber inspiring groups from jumping from the left to fascist far right terrorism. Yeah, it's a dark world.
Well, before we talk about prison reform real quick, as I know we got to wrap up at some point, but I do want to just say, I see a lot of what he talks about through here as stuff that I saw as pretty accepted thought processes for a lot of the families that I grew up with in the homeschool community, where there is that they became more isolationist, away from society, and of course, just a total mistrust of the government and the whole concept of even like the quiverful movement I grew up in, where it's about raising, having as many kids as possible to raise up for God's army. And the whole implication behind that is kind of what he's talking about, is to rise up. And I think that's where you get a lot of these groups who are, we don't see them as, I know a lot of people don't see the evangelical right as being a big problem, but they've gotten their roots in deep. And, when you have people who are living off the grid, I know a family that had like 12 kids, and the mom never went to the hospital for any of the kids. They were all born without birth certificates. One of them's grown up now, and he was talking about that process. And it was just incredible to me that this kind of extremism, and I feel like his words are kind of precursors to everything I saw, and their fear of Y2K and on the bunkers. And I'm like, this is insanity. Like, they're preparing for something, and nobody who would meet these families would think, oh, these people have a bunker and they're getting ready for this weird war or for the apocalypse or whatever. It's a strange thing if you've been around people of that extremism, to ignore it and to discount it in any way, because I see it as being still pretty strong. And I'm just surprised that, well, I'm really lucky that I got out of it, but there's just a shocking amount of people who I know of who this would speak to really deeply. Like they would really connect with these ideas.
Yeah. There is that really strong like us versus them, and especially with belief, like worrying that even like doubting your own community is like an insult to God or something. Like it's a hard one. And how do you? We need I don't know, like we need to get kids into education, like standardized education, I guess. Sorry. Sorry. Do you want to do prison reform?
Prison reform, yes. I've talked about this before on our podcast, and it's something I feel really strongly about. So, I mean, it's not the least important thing we're talking about, even though it is sort of the last thing we are covering. But what are your thoughts about, how this story kind of plays into that role or that theme?
Yeah. So just so the last part of his life, it's interesting to just think about, like, he's still alive. He's still like where he is now, like what his life is like. He acknowledges that, like, he said like a really interesting thing in an interview, which was like he worries that he will acclimatize to prison life and it will just become his new normal. It'll become I really wonder, like, I would love to see like psychology evaluations of him in prison and over the years, and whether he's like had found more peace of mind or not. But so he wants to be a hermit who could read a lot of books undisturbed in a very small one-room cabin and take short breaks to bathe in the beauty of the forest. Now, he had a perfectionist mindset about desiring to find mental well-being in the forest, which was never being disturbed by other people. So it's interesting to note that, short of buying vast acres of wildlife habitat for him, guarding it so no one can get in, and not letting planes fly overhead, we've pretty much helped him achieve the next best thing in a prison cell, as far as he is a manifestation of his traumas. And the same can be said for violent people who get to extort and be violent with other prison inmates without much consequence. And I think that presents a really interesting problem for conservatives who like to think prison is retribution, because sometimes prison can be what the traumatized person desires. So they don't have to wrestle with as much choice. And that although that may only be true for a minority of people, it can be reflective of emotional states of mind within the majority of us. So the only real solution for me there is not to be satisfied with giving traumatized people, to an extent, emotionally what they want, but to heal the trauma and learn patterns of behavior that lead them to that point in their life. Yeah.
I can't help but just the one thing I have to say about that is that I like that you put it that way, because in my mind, what I've just been seeing so much of, like learning about at least the U.S. incarceration system, is that most people see it as it's a punishment, whereas the whole idea of jail and prison is supposed to be reforming people and putting them in a place where when they are released, they're not going to go back and continue on that same path. There's going to be other options, but we've done it in a way where it's not about that anymore. It's about purely just putting someone away, punishing them, and like, you get what you're deserved. And then that doesn't help the recidivism and how these crimes, they're pretty much set on a path to just repeat, rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat. And we don't give any thought towards their mental health, or, really using this as an opportunity to impact. Some people, of course, are so violent or just so far gone that they're not really somebody who's ever going to live in society again. Like, there's certain things that I understand can't happen, but it is such a problem, and there is such an issue with even prisoners' rights. We're seeing that right now, kind of all these stories coming out about there not being heat, people having heat strokes in the summertime. I think there's like a prison in Texas that like they don't have any air conditioning, and the warden sees it as like well, this is what you deserve, even though they could afford to do it. And just we're treating them as less than human beings. So what do we expect in return? So you're kind of pushing them continuously further in the direction that brought them there in the first place. And that's a huge issue that I don't think we like to talk about.
Yeah. Yeah, slavery is still legal in the Constitution for incarcerated people, like in terms of like that being like a loophole, like people that are pressured into like gang pressured into work in prison, which pays a lot of money because they can undercut the market because they can get products so cheap, and then that doesn't go back into, that doesn't even if you agreed with that, it doesn't even go into like helping the prisons at all. And I think like there's really like simple like holes in people's arguments when they think, like even for liberals that like think that just like, okay, so yeah, we're at least sorting out like the trauma in temporarily holding them in prisons, like yeah, okay, but like are you going to do anything to like heal the trauma? Are you going to like put any like therapeutic measures in place that like, or like preventative measures in place in society? Like it's like it's easy to fall down the rabbit hole of thinking, oh yeah, we're going to like punitively get them what they deserve, even though that's what they want. And then it's easy to fall into the rabbit hole of like, well, let's just like get them what they want in terms of the trauma, but like not do anything else, because we don't have the money for it. But if you prevent it, then you cause less of a problem in society because you actually get people on a good path.
One thing I just urge everybody to just kind of watch and think about and digest is it's been a few years. HBO came out with that series that I think it was Gandolfini had. It was the last thing he produced before he died, but it's basically about this guy who's a taxi cab driver, or his parents he's an immigrant from the Middle East, and he ends up, taking the cab out for a night out, trying to impress a girl. They both take drugs, and he ends up being accused of her murder, and he has no idea if he did it. The whole time you're not sure, but it takes you on a journey through the prison system, and how it turns somebody who possibly was not guilty of this crime into worse than he was before, and just how this prison system and our incarceration system is not meant to rehabilitate or to fix what's going on. It's mainly to just shove somebody somewhere, and it's like, you're in here forever, or if you do good out, you'll most likely repeat again. But it was just it blew my mind that our system is like that. Before a person's even necessarily been deemed guilty, they can be put away in that form or fashion. And then it's like, you see this evolution of this guy that, seems pretty likable, becomes something that's not likable. And even if he ends up being completely exonerated in the end, his life is ruined. His life is done. That's that. So.
Yeah, we definitely, we need to, like, court systems, like America's funny because it's really invested in like court systems, because I think politics is like so like money bought already, like so when in watching courts, like they think they're getting more of like a fair and balanced situation where all the facts are being presented, but the system is still rife with like people getting like being pressured into plea deals because they don't think they're going to don't think they can afford lawyers to defend their case, and lots of people spending lots of years in prison for crimes they didn't commit.
Yeah.
And the system needs a lot of reform.
Yeah. Well, that's, we've talked about a lot of cheery things today.
Yeah.
Everything needs to be fixed. Who's going to fix it? Well, as a way to end, how would you recommend people kind of take what we talked about today and maybe hopefully turn it into something a little bit more positive or educational?
In terms of campaigning?
Or anything the average person can do to make a difference in their own part, because that's the thing is like we have lots of people shouting, but we need to make sure that we as individuals are, really supporting the causes that we find important and not just talking about them. We can talk all day, but how do people get involved in some positive stuff?
Yeah, the organisation I love the most is Food Not Bombs. I talked about on the last episode, but any dual power campaigns where you're seeing like a problem in your environment, like it can be like food deserts, like it can be like there's like the nearest like shop that people have to buy their food if they need to walk there, or it's like a garage which like only has like candy bars and like rice and lots of processed food that's not good for you, no fresh vegetables or fruit. So you see a situation like that where the neighborhood is constantly walking back and forth to this shop because it's easy and it's not getting very good food. And you put up like urban guerrilla gardens and greenhouses, and you find you like there's in this country it's transition towns or edible garden. Like there'll be, if you search edible guerrilla gardeners, you can try and find people to try and connect to some activism groups in your region where you're having this effect of meeting the needs of like the poorest people, and then either that becomes like a really beautiful thing, and like you're swapping like seeds and going and helping each other out, or in part it shames the leaders of the state, of like the local council and mayors and stuff, into seeing that they are not providing for this area, like through your publicity, through your advocacy, you're showing them that they're not meeting people's needs, and then you can organize around votes, and then you can organize that mass of people around voting in more left libertarian candidates that are willing to put funding into these like underserved neighborhoods that will help everyone out, because they'll become more educated, become more skilled, and live better lives and contribute more to the world and everything.
Once again, that remind me of the title of the book.
The Unfinished Autobiography of Eileen Warnes.
Yes. Check that out, you guys. And also, where can people find you and what you do if they're interested?
Yeah, I've got a blog called activistjourneys.wordpress.com, and I've got a YouTube channel called Ishka, which is spelled ISHKAH. I don't know why I picked that name. Yeah, that's it. Lovely.
Awesome. Well, Theo, it's been wonderful talking to you again. Hopefully we can have another conversation. Hopefully I try to reel in. She doesn't like what I have to say. I try to reel in my politics a little bit, but it's difficult for me. I'm extremely passionate, but we can all make a difference in whatever way we can. So thank you for walking me through that case today.
That's awesome. Yeah.
All
Maybe
right.
I'll have to do it again.
Yeah, absolutely. Take care and keep up the good work.